The auction hammer came down with a sharp crack that echoed through the packed ballroom at the Brown Palace Hotel, and I watched my grandmother's emerald necklace disappear into the hands of a stranger for $12,000. Before we jump, back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Patricia Whitman stood at the back of the room, her silver hair perfectly coiffed, accepting congratulations from Denver's elite as if she'd just orchestrated some magnificent charity event. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the necklace she'd just sold had been appraised by my insurance company 6 months ago at $180,000. I sat in the third row, anonymous behind my oversized sunglasses, watching my life's most precious possessions being auctioned off piece by piece. The Cartier bracelet my grandmother wore to her debutante ball went for $8,000. The Art Deco diamond ring that survived the Great Depression sold for $15,000. Each gavel strike felt like a nail in Patricia's coffin, though she had no idea she was building it herself. When the final lot closed and Patricia walked toward the hotel bar to celebrate with her friends, I pulled out my phone and opened the Notes app where I'd been tracking every sale. Total auction proceeds: $147,000. Total actual value of my stolen collection: just over $2.3 million. The insurance documentation in my purse told a very different story than the bargain basement appraisals Patricia had relied on when she decided to fund her son David's third wedding with my inheritance. I allowed myself a small smile as I gathered my things and headed for the exit. Patricia thought she was celebrating the perfect crime, but she'd actually just handed me the evidence I needed to destroy her completely. The morning everything changed started like any other Tuesday in late May. I was rushing around our Cherry Creek apartment, gathering presentation materials for a client meeting at Mountain View Marketing Agency, when I noticed the strange silence from our bedroom. Usually, David would be on his morning conference call with his development team by 7:30, his voice carrying through the thin walls as he discussed property acquisitions and zoning permits. Today, the silence felt different, heavier somehow. I found him sitting on the edge of our unmade bed, staring at his phone with an expression I'd never seen before. Not the usual stress from work deadlines or the occasional frustration when his mother called with her endless list of social obligations. This was something else entirely. His face had gone pale, and his hands were actually trembling as he held the device. "David?" I set my laptop bag down and moved closer. "What's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." He looked up at me, with eyes that seemed to struggle to focus, as if he was trying to process information that his brain couldn't quite accept. "Vanessa called off the wedding." The words hung in the air between us like a question mark. David had been planning his third wedding for 8 months, throwing himself into the details with an enthusiasm that had surprised me. His previous marriages had been quick courthouse affairs, but this time he'd wanted something special. Something worthy of the woman he claimed was his soulmate. Patricia had been over the moon, already planning the guest list and researching venues before David had even proposed. "She just called it off?" I asked, settling beside him on the bed. "What happened? Did you two have a fight?" David shook his head slowly, his gaze returning to the phone screen. "She said she couldn't go through with it. Said she realized she wasn't ready for marriage again. She's moving back to Seattle next week." I felt a complex mixture of emotions wash over me. Relief, certainly, because I'd never quite warmed to Vanessa Brooks despite my best efforts. There was something calculating about the way she interacted with David, something that reminded me uncomfortably of his mother's manipulative tendencies. But I also felt genuine sympathy for David, who had been genuinely excited about starting this new chapter of his life. "I'm sorry, David. I know how much this meant to you." He stood abruptly and began pacing the length of our small bedroom, running his hands through his dark hair. 8 months of planning. The deposits, the venue, the catering. My mother's going to lose her mind. She's already sent out the invitations. The dress fittings, the flowers, everything. The mention of Patricia sent a small chill down my spine. David's mother had been more invested in this wedding than even the bride and groom seemed to be. She'd taken charge of every detail, from the color scheme to the menu selection, treating the event like her personal project. I'd watched her transform from merely overbearing to completely obsessive as the date approached. "What are you going to tell her?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. David's pacing intensified. "I can't. Not yet. She's been working on this for months. She's so proud of the connections she's made, the vendors she's lined up. This wedding was supposed to be her chance to show Denver society what the Whitman family is capable of. There it was. The real issue wasn't David's broken heart or even the financial loss from canceled deposits. It was the public humiliation that Patricia would face when word spread through her social circles. In Patricia's world, appearances mattered more than anything else, and a canceled wedding would be seen as a family failure. I watched David struggle with the weight of disappointing his mother, and I felt the familiar frustration that had been building throughout our 2-year relationship. At 35, David was a successful real estate developer with his own company and a portfolio of impressive projects throughout Colorado. Yet when it came to his mother, he transformed into an anxious child seeking approval. "Maybe it's for the best," I suggested gently. "If Vanessa wasn't sure, it's better that she realized it now rather than after the ceremony." David stopped pacing and turned to face me, his expression shifting from distress to something that looked almost like panic. "You don't understand. The money for the wedding, all the deposits and payments my mother made, she liquidated some investments to cover the costs. She can't get that money back now." Something cold settled in my stomach. "What kind of investments?" David's eyes darted away from mine, focusing on a spot somewhere over my shoulder. Some antique pieces she'd been holding, family heirlooms that weren't really being used. She had them appraised and sold them to cover the wedding expenses. The room seemed to tilt slightly. "What antique pieces, David?" The silence stretched between us until it became almost unbearable. When David finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Your grandmother's jewelry collection." The words hit me like a physical blow. My grandmother's jewelry collection had been in my possession since her death 3 years ago. It was more than just valuable pieces. It was my connection to a woman who had raised me after my parents died in a car accident when I was 7. Every necklace, every ring, every delicate bracelet held memories of afternoon tea parties where she'd let me try on her treasures, of bedtime stories about the glamorous parties where she'd worn each piece. "My jewelry?" I heard my voice rising, despite my efforts to stay calm. "David, that jewelry belongs to me. It was left to me in my grandmother's will." David's face flushed red, and he began pacing again with renewed agitation. I know, but my mother said she'd talked to you about it. She said you'd agreed to let her handle the sale since you never wore any of it anyway." The lie was so brazen, so completely fabricated, that I actually laughed, not from humor, but from pure shock at the audacity. "I never spoke to your mother about selling my jewelry. I would never agree to something like that." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "David, some of those pieces are irreplaceable. They belonged to my great-grandmother. They're over 100 years old." David stopped pacing and sank back onto the bed, his head in his hands. "Oh, God. She said you were fine with it. She said you thought it was a good investment in our family's future." The manipulation was so transparent that I wondered how David couldn't see it. Patricia had simply decided that my inheritance would fund her son's wedding, and she'd constructed whatever narrative necessary to justify the theft. The fact that David had believed her without even asking me directly spoke volumes about both his relationship with his mother and his relationship with me. "Where are my jewelry pieces now, David?" His voice was muffled by his hands. "She already sold them. Last month. She said the appraisals came back lower than expected, but there was enough to cover the wedding costs." I stood up slowly, my mind racing through the implications. My grandmother's collection included pieces from the 1920s through the 1960s, collected during her travels throughout Europe and inherited from her own family. I had detailed documentation of every piece, including insurance appraisals I'd commissioned shortly after inheriting them. The total value had been assessed at over $2 million. What did she get for them? David looked up at me with miserable eyes. "About $150,000. She said that was a fair price based on the appraisals." The number confirmed my worst suspicions. Either Patricia had deliberately sought out fraudulent appraisals to justify a quick sale, or she'd been spectacularly incompetent in her research. Either way, she'd just stolen my inheritance and sold it for a fraction of its true value. I walked to our bedroom window and stared out at the Denver skyline, trying to process the magnitude of what had happened. My grandmother's jewelry wasn't just valuable. It was my only tangible connection to my family history. Patricia had stolen my past and sold it to fund a wedding that wasn't even happening anymore. "Amanda, I'm so sorry. I had no idea she hadn't talked to you. When she said you were on board with the plan, I just assumed." I turned back to face David, and for the first time in our relationship, I saw him clearly. Not as the successful businessman or the devoted son, but as a man who had allowed his mother to manipulate him into participating in theft. Whether he'd known it was theft or not was becoming irrelevant. "I need to think about this," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I need to understand exactly what happened and figure out how to fix it." David stood and reached for me, but I stepped back instinctively. The gesture hurt him. I could see it in his eyes, but I needed space to process what I'd just learned. My life had just shifted fundamentally, and I needed to understand the new landscape before I could decide how to navigate it. "What are you going to do?" David asked. I picked up my laptop bag and headed toward the bedroom door. "I'm going to work. I need time to think, and I have client presentations that can't wait." As I reached the doorway, I paused and looked back at David, who was still sitting on the edge of the bed looking lost and defeated. "David, I need you to get me every piece of documentation about the sale. Appraisals, receipts, correspondence, everything. If your mother wants to fix this, she's going to need to provide complete transparency about what she did." David nodded eagerly, grasping at the possibility of redemption. "Of course. I'll call her right now and get everything." I shook my head. "Don't call her yet. I want to think about how to approach this before we involve Patricia. Just gather the documentation first." As I drove through Denver traffic toward my office, my mind was already working through the implications of what I'd learned. Patricia Whitman had stolen my inheritance, but she'd also made a critical error in undervaluing what she'd taken. The gap between the true value and what she'd received was so enormous that it suggested either criminal intent or spectacular incompetence. Either way, I had options. Legal options, certainly, but also strategic options that could turn Patricia's theft into her complete downfall. The wedding she'd stolen to fund was canceled, which meant she'd destroyed my inheritance for nothing. Now it was time to decide whether I wanted simple restitution or complete justice. By the time I reached the Mountain View marketing agency offices, I'd made my decision. Patricia Whitman had spent years treating me like an inconvenient obstacle to her control over David. She'd tolerated my relationship with her son because she couldn't prevent it, but she'd never accepted me as family. This theft proved that she saw me as someone whose possessions were available for her use whenever convenient. She was about to learn that stealing from Amanda Foster was the biggest mistake of her perfectly orchestrated life. The elevator ride to my office on the 15th floor gave me time to construct a mental plan. I would need documentation, expert appraisals, legal consultation, and most importantly, I would need to understand exactly how Patricia had managed to sell jewelry that legally belonged to me. The story David had told me had holes that suggested either deliberate deception or criminal fraud. As the elevator doors opened and I stepped into the familiar bustle of the marketing agency, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. The thrill of a challenge that would require every skill I'd developed in my professional career. Patricia thought she was dealing with David's accommodating girlfriend who would accept whatever story she was told. She was about to discover that she'd declared war on someone who specialized in strategic communications, who understood how to research, document, and expose the truth in ways that would be both devastating and public. The woman who had spent her career helping clients navigate crisis management was about to become Patricia Whitman's worst nightmare. My grandmother had taught me that family heirlooms weren't just valuable objects, they were symbols of family strength and resilience passed down through generations. Patricia had stolen my symbols, but she'd also given me something far more powerful. The motivation to prove that underestimating Amanda Foster was a mistake no one made twice. The war for my inheritance was about to begin, and Patricia had no idea that she'd already provided me with all the ammunition I needed to destroy her completely. The Mountain View Marketing Agency occupied 3 floors of a sleek glass building in downtown Denver, and my corner office on the 15th floor provided a panoramic view of the Rocky Mountains. On any other day, that view would have calmed me, but today I barely noticed the snow-capped peaks as I closed my office door and immediately began researching jewelry fraud laws on my computer. My first instinct as a marketing professional was to gather intelligence before taking any action. In my line of work, rushing into crisis management without complete information was a recipe for disaster. Patricia had made her move, but she'd done it based on incomplete knowledge of what she was actually stealing. That gave me a significant advantage if I played it correctly. I opened a new browser window and began searching for information about jewelry appraisals and estate sales in the Denver area. Within minutes, I found the auction house listing that made my blood run cold. Prestige Estate Auctions had held a sale 3 weeks ago featuring what they described as a private collection of vintage and antique jewelry. The listing included photographs of several pieces I recognized immediately. There was my great-grandmother's sapphire and diamond brooch, the one she'd worn in her wedding portrait in 1924. The auction description read simply, Art Deco sapphire brooch, circa 1920s, estimated value $800 to $1,200. I stared at the photograph, remembering the insurance appraisal that had valued that single piece at $45,000. My hands were shaking as I clicked through the rest of the auction catalog. Every piece of my grandmother's collection was there, each one described with generic language that completely failed to capture their true provenance or value. The emerald necklace that had belonged to my great-great-grandmother, a piece that had survived 2 world wars and the Great Depression, was listed as vintage emerald necklace, needs cleaning, estimated value $3,000 to $5,000. The insurance documentation in my filing cabinet at home listed that necklace's appraised value at $180,000. Patricia hadn't just sold my inheritance for a fraction of its worth, she'd essentially given it away. I printed every page of the auction catalog and began making detailed notes about each piece. The discrepancies between the auction estimates and the actual values were so extreme that they suggested either complete incompetence or deliberate fraud. Either way, Patricia had participated in what amounted to the theft and destruction of a multi-million-dollar estate. My phone buzzed with a text message from David. Found some of the paperwork. Can we meet for lunch? I think there's more to this than my mother told me. I stared at the message for a long moment, trying to decide how much to share with David at this stage. His complicity in the theft was still unclear, and I needed to be careful not to reveal the full extent of my investigation until I understood where his loyalties lay. I texted back, "Meet me at Mercantile at noon. Bring everything you found." Mercantile Dining and Provision was a trendy restaurant in Union Station, busy enough to provide privacy through ambient noise, but public enough to keep our conversation civil. I arrived early and chose a corner table where I could see the ijabita entrance and spread out documents if necessary. David appeared at exactly noon, looking haggard and carrying a manila folder that seemed surprisingly thin for what should have been extensive documentation of a major financial transaction. He slid into the seat across from me and immediately launched into what sounded like a rehearsed apology. "Amanda, I've been thinking about this all morning, and I realize how completely screwed up this situation is. I should have talked to you directly before my mother did anything with your jewelry. I should have insisted on being part of any conversations about it." I studied his face, looking for signs of genuine remorse versus damage control. David was a skilled businessman, which meant he was also skilled at presenting information in the most favorable light possible. "What did you find in the paperwork?" He opened the folder and spread several documents across the table. I could see immediately that the documentation was incomplete and suspicious. There were 3 appraisal documents from something called Mountain States Appraisal Services, each one listing absurdly low values for pieces I knew were worth exponentially more. "These appraisals don't make sense," I said, picking up the document that valued my grandmother's diamond tennis bracelet at $1,500. "David, this bracelet alone is worth more than everything your mother supposedly received for the entire collection." David's face went pale as he looked at the numbers. "What do you mean? These are official appraisals from a licensed company." I pulled out my phone and did a quick search for Mountain States Appraisal Services. The results were immediately suspicious. The company had been established only 6 months ago, had no physical address listed, and appeared to exist solely as a website with generic stock photos and no staff credentials. "David, this isn't a real appraisal company. This is either a front for fraudulent valuations, or your mother found someone willing to provide fake appraisals to justify a quick sale." The color drained completely from David's face as he stared at the search results on my phone. "But she said she researched everything carefully. She said she wanted to make sure we got fair market value." I felt a mix of pity and frustration as I watched David grapple with the reality of his mother's deception. Either he was genuinely shocked by this revelation, or he was an excellent actor. Given Patricia's history of manipulation, I was inclined to believe that David had been as much a victim of her schemes as I had been. "There's more," I said, pulling out the printed auction catalog pages. "I found where your mother actually sold the jewelry. Look at these listings and tell me if they match what she told you about the sale." David's hands trembled as he looked through the auction photographs. I watched his expression shift from confusion to horror as he recognized piece after piece of my grandmother's collection listed with laughably low estimates. "This can't be right," he whispered. "She told me she worked with a reputable estate sale company that specialized in high-end jewelry. She said they assured her these were fair market prices." I leaned forward, keeping my voice low but intense. "David, your mother stole over $2 million worth of jewelry and sold it for less than $150,000. Whether she did it intentionally or through incompetence doesn't matter from a legal standpoint. This is theft, and the financial damages are enormous." David pushed the documents away and buried his face in his hands. "Oh, God, what have we done?" "Amanda, I swear I had no idea. If I'd known the real value, I never would have let her touch your inheritance." I believed him, which created a new complication in my plans for dealing with Patricia. If David was genuinely innocent of intentional wrongdoing, I needed to be careful not to destroy him in the process of bringing down his mother. But that didn't mean I was going to let sentiment interfere with getting justice. "Here's what's going to happen," I said, my voice taking on the authoritative tone I used in client crisis management sessions. "You're going to help me document everything your mother did, and you're going to support me in getting restitution for the theft. In exchange, I'll make sure that your role in this is presented as unwitting participation rather than conspiracy." David looked up at me with desperate gratitude. "Yes, absolutely, whatever you need. How do we fix this?" I gathered the documents and slid them back into the folder. "First, I need to understand exactly how your mother gained access to my jewelry. Those pieces were in a safety deposit box at First National Bank. She would have needed my authorization or fraudulent documentation to remove them." David's face went even paler, if that was possible. "She said you'd given her power of attorney to handle your financial affairs while you were traveling for work." The lie was so audacious that I actually laughed out loud. "David, I've never given your mother power of attorney for anything. I've never even discussed my financial affairs with her beyond basic pleasantries about work." "She showed me documents," David said weakly. "Official-looking papers with your signature." Now we were getting to the heart of Patricia's criminal activity. Forging power of attorney documents was a serious federal crime, especially when used to access safety deposit boxes and steal valuable property. Patricia hadn't just committed theft, she'd committed multiple felonies in the process. "I need to see those documents," I said, "and I need you to help me understand exactly how your mother convinced the bank to give her access to my safety deposit box." David nodded eagerly, clearly desperate to find some way to make amends for his role in the disaster. "I'll get everything from her tonight. She keeps all her important papers in a filing cabinet in her study." I studied David's face, trying to gauge his reliability as an ally in what was about to become a complex legal and strategic campaign against his mother. His willingness to help was encouraging, but I needed to be certain that he wouldn't warn Patricia about my investigation or give her time to destroy evidence. "David, this is important. You cannot tell your mother that I know about the jewelry sale yet. If she realizes that I'm investigating what she did, she might try to cover her tracks or destroy documentation. I need time to build a complete case before we confront her." David nodded vigorously. "I understand. I won't say anything. But Amanda, what's going to happen to her? I mean, legally speaking?" The question revealed the depth of David's naivety about the severity of his mother's crimes. Patricia had committed multiple felonies that could result in decades in federal prison, and the financial damages were large enough to ensure that prosecutors would take the case seriously. "That depends on whether she cooperates with making restitution and how much evidence we find of deliberate criminal intent," I said carefully. "If she can prove this was all a misunderstanding based on bad advice, and if she can arrange to compensate me for the full value of what was stolen, it might be possible to resolve this without criminal charges." It was a lie, of course. I had no intention of letting Patricia escape criminal prosecution for her actions. But David didn't need to know that yet, and the possibility of leniency might motivate him to be more helpful in gathering evidence against his mother. We parted ways at the restaurant with David promising to retrieve Patricia's documentation that evening and meet me the following morning to review everything together. As I walked back to my office, I was already planning the next phase of my investigation. Patricia's theft had been sophisticated enough to require advanced planning and preparation. She'd arranged for fraudulent appraisals, forged legal documents, and convinced a bank to give her access to someone else's safety deposit box. That level of organization suggested that this wasn't her first criminal venture, and it meant that there were likely other victims of her schemes. Back in my office, I began researching Patricia Whitman's background with the thoroughness I usually reserved for competitive intelligence gathering for major clients. What I found was a pattern of financial manipulation and questionable business, dealings stretching back over 20 years. Patricia served on the boards of 3 different charitable foundations in Denver, each one handling significant amounts of donated funds. She'd been involved in organizing high-end charity auctions where wealthy donors contributed valuable items for sale to support various causes. Her social media presence showed her regularly photographed at luxury events, always wearing expensive jewelry and designer clothes that seemed inconsistent with her claimed income as a widow living on investment returns. Most interestingly, I found several news articles about disputes involving charity auctions Patricia had organized. In each case, donors had complained that their contributions had been undervalued or that the proceeds from sales had been less than expected. The complaints had been dismissed as misunderstandings or donor dissatisfaction with market conditions, but the pattern was striking. I spent the rest of the afternoon creating a detailed timeline of Patricia's activities and financial transactions over the past 5 years. By the time I left the office that evening, I had the foundation for a comprehensive investigation that would expose not just the theft of my jewelry, but what appeared to be a long-running pattern of financial fraud targeting wealthy families throughout Denver's social elite. My phone rang as I was driving home through Cherry Creek, and I saw David's name on the caller ID. I answered using my car's hands-free system, expecting an update on his progress retrieving documents from his mother's files. "Amanda, we have a problem." David's voice was tight with anxiety. "I went to my mother's house to get the paperwork and she's not here. Her housekeeper said she left this afternoon for an extended trip to visit her sister in Phoenix. She packed several suitcases and said she might be gone for several weeks." The timing was too convenient to be coincidental. Patricia had somehow learned that her theft was being investigated, and she was attempting to flee before facing the consequences. That suggested either that David had warned her despite his promises, or that she had other sources of information about my activities. "Did she take any documents with her?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. "Her filing cabinet is completely empty," David confirmed. "Everything's gone. Financial records, legal documents, correspondence, all of it." Patricia's flight was actually good news from my perspective, even though David clearly didn't understand. Why? Running away with evidence was consciousness of guilt, and it would make it much easier to convince law enforcement and prosecutors that her actions had been deliberate crimes rather than innocent mistakes. "David, I need you to call your mother right now and find out exactly where she's staying in Phoenix. Tell her you're worried about her sudden departure and you want to make sure she's safe." "Okay, but why? What are you planning to do?" I pulled into the parking garage of our apartment building and sat in my car for a moment, considering how much to reveal to David about the next phase of my plans. His mother's flight had accelerated my timeline significantly, but it had also provided me with additional evidence of criminal intent. "I'm going to contact law enforcement and report the theft of my jewelry," I said. Patricia's decision to flee with evidence is going to make that conversation much more straightforward than it would have been otherwise. David was quiet for a long moment, and I could almost hear him processing the implications of what I'd said. His mother wasn't just in trouble. She was in serious criminal trouble that could result in federal charges and prison time. "Amanda, please, let me try to reach her first. Maybe there's still a way to work this out without involving the police. If she can arrange to pay you back for the full value of the jewelry, maybe we can resolve this privately." I understood David's desperation to protect his mother, but Patricia had moved far beyond the point where private resolution was possible. Her flight with evidence demonstrated that she had no intention of making voluntary restitution, and her pattern of financial fraud suggested that my jewelry was just the latest in a series of crimes that needed to be fully investigated. "Call her," I said. "But David, whether she cooperates or not, I'm filing a police report tomorrow morning." Patricia had the opportunity to handle this honestly, and instead she chose to run. That decision has consequences. As I hung up and headed toward the elevator to our apartment, I felt a strange sense of calm settling over me. The investigation phase of my campaign against Patricia was coming to an end, and the legal phase was about to begin. Everything that happened from this point forward would be documented, official, and ultimately very public. Patricia Whitman had spent her life manipulating people and situations to get what she wanted, always confident that her social connections and carefully constructed reputation would protect her from serious consequences. She was about to discover that stealing from the wrong person could bring down everything she'd spent decades building. The elevator ride to our floor gave me time to plan my approach for the following morning. I would start with the Denver Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit, providing them with all the documentation I'd gathered about the theft and Patricia's fraudulent methods. Then I would contact the FBI, since the forged power of attorney documents and interstate flight with evidence made this a federal case. But most importantly, I would contact my insurance company and initiate a claim for the full appraised value of my stolen jewelry. Insurance fraud was a serious crime, and once my insurer began their own investigation into Patricia's actions, she would face additional criminal charges and civil liability that would ensure she could never again target innocent victims. As I opened the door to our apartment and saw David pacing anxiously in the living room with his phone pressed to his ear, I realized that the next few days would determine not just whether I received justice for Patricia's crimes, but whether my relationship with David could survive the complete destruction of his family's carefully maintained facade. Patricia had stolen my inheritance, but she'd also given me something far more valuable: the motivation and evidence necessary to expose her as the criminal she'd always been. Tomorrow, the real war would begin. Detective Maria Santos had the kind of weathered face that suggested she'd seen every variety of human greed and deception that Denver had to offer. Her office at the Financial Crimes Unit was cramped and cluttered, with case files, but her attention was completely focused as I spread my documentation across her desk at 8:30 on Wednesday morning. "So, let me make sure I understand this correctly," Detective Santos said, reviewing the insurance appraisals with practiced eyes. "Your mother-in-law accessed your safety deposit box using forged power of attorney documents, removed jewelry worth over $2 million, obtained fraudulent appraisals showing values of less than 10% of the actual worth, and then sold everything through an auction house for approximately $150,000. I nodded, appreciating her ability to cut through the emotional complexity and focus on the bare criminal facts. "That's correct. And when I discovered the theft, she immediately fled to Arizona with all physical evidence of her crimes." "Detective?" Santos leaned back in her chair and studied me with the kind of assessment I recognized from my own professional interactions with clients. She was deciding whether I was a credible victim or someone with ulterior motives seeking to use law enforcement to settle a family dispute. "Mrs. Foster, I have to ask this directly. Is there any possibility that you did give Patricia Whitman some form of authorization to handle your jewelry, even informally, and this is actually a misunderstanding about the value and terms of the sale?" The question didn't offend me because I understood the necessity of eliminating alternative explanations before proceeding with a criminal investigation. "Detective, I've never had any conversation with Patricia about my jewelry beyond her occasionally complimenting a piece I was wearing. I certainly never gave her permission to access my safety deposit box or sell my inheritance." I pulled out my phone and showed her the call log and text message history between Patricia and myself over the past 6 months. "As you can see, our communication has been limited to family dinner arrangements and holiday planning. There's no discussion of financial matters or jewelry sales anywhere in our correspondence." Detective Santos scrolled through the messages, nodding as she confirmed the absence of any communication that could be construed as authorization for Patricia's actions. "And you're certain about the true value of the jewelry that was taken?" I handed her the comprehensive insurance appraisals I'd commissioned 18 months earlier, when I'd increased my coverage limits. These were done by Rothschild Appraisals, one of the most respected firms in the country. They specialize in estate jewelry and antique pieces. Each item was photographed, researched for provenance, and valued using current market comparables. Detective Santos spent several minutes reviewing the detailed appraisal documents, occasionally comparing the descriptions and photographs to the auction catalog listings I'd provided. The discrepancies were so extreme that even someone without expertise in jewelry valuation could see that fraud had occurred. "This is definitely criminal," she said finally. "The question is whether we're dealing with theft, fraud, forgery, or all three. I'm going to need to coordinate with the FBI since the forged documents and interstate flight make this a federal matter. She reached for her phone and dialed an extension. Agent Rodriguez, I've got a case here that's going to need joint jurisdiction. Can you come down to my office? While we waited for the FBI agent to arrive, Detective Santos began documenting my statement with the thoroughness that gave me confidence in her competence. She asked detailed questions about my relationship with Patricia, the timeline of discovering the theft, and my knowledge of David's involvement. Your husband seems to have been manipulated rather than complicit, she observed. But we'll need to interview him separately to confirm that assessment. FBI agent Carlos Rodriguez arrived 20 minutes later, carrying himself with the kind of quiet authority that suggested significant experience with complex financial crimes. He was younger than I'd expected, probably in his early 40s, but his questions demonstrated sophisticated understanding of the legal elements involved in Patricia's actions. The forged power of attorney is the most serious charge, Agent Rodriguez explained after reviewing my documentation. That's federal document fraud with a potential sentence of up to 20 years. Add in the theft of property worth over $2 million. And we're talking about charges that could put Patricia Whitman in federal prison for the rest of her life. The severity of the potential consequences was sobering, even though I felt no sympathy for Patricia. She'd made deliberate choices at every step of her criminal enterprise, from researching how to access my safety deposit box to arranging fraudulent appraisals to fleeing when she realized her actions were being investigated. What's our next step? I asked. Detective Santos and Agent Rodriguez exchanged glances before Agent Rodriguez responded. We're going to need to execute search warrants on Patricia's residence and any other properties she controls. We'll also need to freeze her financial accounts to prevent her from hiding assets that could be used for restitution. He paused and studied my face carefully. Mrs. Foster, I need to be clear about something. Once we initiate a federal investigation, this case is going to become very public. Patricia Whitman appears to be well connected in Denver society, and a case of this magnitude involving someone of her social standing will attract significant media attention. The warning was both professional courtesy and strategic assessment. Agent Rodriguez was giving me the opportunity to reconsider whether I wanted to proceed with a public prosecution that would inevitably become a scandal affecting everyone in Patricia's social circle. I understand, I replied. But Patricia's social connections are exactly why this case is important. She's used her reputation and social standing to gain access to other people's valuables. If she's done this to me, she's probably done it to others. Detective Santos nodded approvingly. That's exactly what I was thinking. The pattern of questionable charity auction proceeds suggests this isn't her first fraud. A public investigation might encourage other victims to come forward. Agent Rodriguez made notes in his case file before continuing. We'll coordinate with the Phoenix field office to locate Patricia and execute warrants on any property she might be using there. In the meantime, we need you to provide us with a complete list of every item that was stolen, including detailed descriptions and the insurance appraisal values. I handed him a folder I'd prepared containing photographs, detailed descriptions, and valuation documents for every piece in my grandmother's collection. The preparation impressed both investigators and demonstrated that I was serious about pursuing the case to its conclusion. We'll also need to interview your husband, Detective Santos added. Based on what you've told us, he appears to be a witness rather than a co-conspirator, but we need to document his statement officially. I called David from Detective Santos's office and asked him to come to the police station immediately. His voice was strained when he answered, and I could hear the exhaustion of someone who'd spent the night grappling with the destruction of his family relationships. Have you been able to reach your mother? I asked. She's not answering her phone, David replied. Her sister in Phoenix says Patricia never arrived and she wasn't expecting her. I think my mother lied about where she was going. The revelation that Patricia had provided false information about her destination confirmed that her flight was premeditated rather than spontaneous. She'd planned her escape route carefully, which suggested she'd always known that her actions were criminal and would eventually be discovered. David arrived at the police station 30 minutes later, looking like he'd aged several years overnight. His usually perfect appearance was disheveled, his expensive suit wrinkled, and his face drawn with stress and sleeplessness. Detective Santos and Agent Rodriguez interviewed David separately while I waited in a conference room, reviewing additional documentation they'd requested. Through the thin walls, I could hear David's voice growing more agitated as he realized the full scope of his mother's criminal activity. When the interview concluded, Agent Rodriguez invited me back into Detective Santos's office to discuss the next phases of the investigation. David remained in the conference room, staring at the table with the expression of someone whose worldview had just been fundamentally shattered. "Your husband's statement corroborates your account completely," Agent Rodriguez reported. "He was clearly manipulated by his mother, and there's no evidence of criminal intent on his part. However, his testimony about the forged documents and the timeline of events strengthens our case significantly." Detective Santos pulled out a legal pad covered with notes from David's interview. He was able to provide details about his mother's recent behavior that suggests she's been planning this fraud for months. The story about needing money for the wedding appears to have been a cover narrative to justify actions she was already committed to taking. The systematic nature of Patricia's planning was both disturbing and advantageous for building a strong criminal case. Premeditation would make it impossible for her legal team to argue that the theft was impulsive or based on misunderstanding. "What did David tell you about Patricia's other financial activities?" I asked. Agent Rodriguez consulted his notes before responding. He mentioned that his mother has been involved in organizing charity auctions and estate sales for several wealthy families over the past few years. He thought it was volunteer work, but some of the amounts of money involved suggest she may have been operating an unlicensed auction business. The implications were staggering. If Patricia had been systematically defrauding wealthy families through fake charity work and unauthorized estate sales, the financial damages could be in the tens of millions of dollars. My stolen jewelry might be just one small part of a massive criminal enterprise. "We're going to expand the investigation to examine Patricia's involvement with these other transactions," Detective Santos explained. "If there are additional victims, we want to identify them and include their losses in the criminal charges." Agent Rodriguez stood and gathered his files. "Mrs. Foster, I want you to understand that this investigation is going to take time. Financial fraud cases are complex, especially when they involve multiple victims and interstate activity. We're probably looking at 6 to 12 months before we can bring this to trial." The timeline was longer than I'd hoped, but I understood the necessity of building a comprehensive case that would ensure Patricia faced appropriate consequences for the full scope of her criminal activity. "What happens in the meantime? Can you recover any of my jewelry?" "We'll contact the auction house and try to trace where the individual pieces were sold," Detective Santos replied. "Some items might be recoverable if the buyers are willing to cooperate. Others are probably gone permanently, but the financial restitution should compensate you for the losses." As I prepared to leave the police station, Agent Rodriguez handed me his business card and a case number for reference. "Mrs. Foster, I want you to know that cases like this are exactly why we have federal fraud statutes. People like Patricia Whitman use their social standing and reputation to exploit trust, and they need to face serious consequences." I drove back to my office feeling a complex mixture of satisfaction and apprehension. The criminal investigation was now officially underway, which meant that Patricia would face justice for her actions. But it also meant that my life was about to become significantly more complicated as the case progressed through the legal system. My phone rang as I was parking at the Mountain View Marketing Agency building. The caller ID showed Nicole Chen, my closest friend, and the one person outside of David who knew details about my family history and the importance of my grandmother's jewelry collection. "Amanda, I just saw the news alert about Patricia Whitman being investigated for theft. Please tell me you're not involved in this mess." The speed with which news of the investigation had leaked surprised me, though I should have anticipated that anything involving someone of Patricia's social prominence would attract immediate media attention. Actually, Nicole, I'm very much involved. Patricia stole my grandmother's jewelry collection and sold it to pay for David's wedding. Nicole's shocked silence stretched for several seconds before she responded. "Oh my God, Amanda. Are you serious? How much are we talking about?" "Over $2 million in appraised value. She sold it for less than $150,000 through a fraudulent auction scheme." "Jesus Christ," Nicole whispered. "Amanda, this is going to be huge. Patricia Whitman is on the board of half the major charities in Denver. If she's been stealing from families, the scandal is going to destroy dozens of reputations." Nicole's observation highlighted an aspect of the case I hadn't fully considered. Patricia's criminal activity wouldn't just affect her personally, it would contaminate every organization and social circle she'd been part of. The investigation would inevitably expose other questionable transactions and force Denver's elite to examine their own involvement with Patricia's schemes. "I'm at the office," I said. "Can you meet me for coffee? I need to talk through the implications of what's happening." "I'll be there in 20 minutes, Nicole replied. "Amanda, you need to be prepared for this to get very ugly very quickly. People with Patricia's level of social connections don't go down quietly." As I rode the elevator up to my office, I reflected on Nicole's warning. Patricia's theft of my jewelry had seemed like a personal crime, but the federal investigation was about to transform it into a public scandal that would affect hundreds of people throughout Denver's social and charitable communities. The elevator. Doors opened to reveal my assistant Sarah waiting with an expression of barely contained excitement. "Amanda, your phone has been ringing non-stop for the past hour. Reporters from 3 different news stations want to talk to you about the Patricia Whitman investigation." The media attention was starting even faster than I'd anticipated. Patricia's social prominence made her criminal charges newsworthy, but my role as the victim who'd triggered the investigation made me a person of interest for journalists seeking to understand the story's human dimensions. "Hold all media calls for now," I instructed Sarah. "I need to consult with the FBI agents about what I can and cannot discuss publicly." In my office, I closed the door and called Agent Rodriguez to ask about media protocol during the investigation. His guidance was clear. I could acknowledge that I was a victim of theft and that I was cooperating with law enforcement, but I should avoid discussing specific evidence or details about the charges Patricia would face. Nicole arrived at my office 30 minutes later, carrying 2 large coffees and wearing the expression of someone who'd spent the intervening time researching everything she could find about financial fraud investigations. As a senior marketing director at a competing agency, Nicole understood the importance of controlling narrative and public perception during crisis situations. "I've been thinking about your situation," Nicole said, settling into the chair across from my desk. "You need to be very strategic about how you handle the media attention. This story has all the elements that reporters love: wealthy socialite, stolen family heirlooms, federal investigation, social scandal." She was right, of course. The story would be irresistible to news outlets, especially when they learned about the massive discrepancy between the auction prices and the true value of my stolen jewelry. The public would be fascinated by Patricia's audacity and by the sophisticated fraud scheme she'd operated under the cover of charitable work. "What do you think I should do?" I asked. Nicole pulled out a legal pad covered with notes she'd apparently been making during her drive to my office. "First, you need legal representation immediately, not just for the criminal case, but for the media management and potential civil litigation. Second, you need to control the narrative by being proactive, rather than reactive in your public statements." Her advice was sound, but it highlighted how much my life was about to change. I'd gone from being someone who handled media relations for corporate clients to being the subject of media attention myself. The skills were transferable, but the emotional complexity of managing my own crisis was entirely different. There's something else you need to consider, Nicole continued. If Patricia has been defrauding other families the way she defrauded you, those victims are going to need someone to organize them and coordinate their response to the investigation. You have the expertise to lead that effort. The suggestion hadn't occurred to me, but it made perfect sense. As the victim who'd uncovered Patricia's crimes and initiated the investigation, I was uniquely positioned to help other victims understand their legal options and coordinate their participation in the prosecution. You're talking about turning this into a class action situation, I said. Exactly. And more than that, you could use this experience to build a practice area around financial fraud recovery. Think about it, Amanda. You have marketing expertise, you understand crisis management, and you're about to become an expert on jewelry fraud and estate theft. That's a unique combination of skills. As Nicole outlined her vision for how I could transform my victimization into professional opportunity, I realized that Patricia's theft had inadvertently provided me with something valuable: the motivation and expertise to help other people who'd been targeted by similar crimes. My phone buzzed with a text message from Agent Rodriguez. Search warrants executed. Need to meet tomorrow morning to review evidence recovered from Patricia's residence. The investigation was accelerating rapidly, which meant that the media, attention and public scrutiny would intensify correspondingly. In less than 24 hours, I'd gone from being an unknown marketing executive to being the central figure in a federal fraud investigation that was about to expose one of Denver's most respected socialites as a career criminal. Patricia Whitman had stolen my inheritance, but she'd also given me something far more powerful: the opportunity to ensure that she could never again use her social standing to exploit innocent victims. The war was just beginning, and I was finally ready to fight it publicly. The Denver Country Club's main dining room fell into complete silence as Patricia Whitman walked through the entrance doors on Thursday evening, her chin raised defiantly. Despite the FBI surveillance team that had followed her from the airport, word of her return had spread through Denver's social circles within hours, and the club's members watched her progress across the room with the fascination of spectators at a public execution. I observed from a corner table where I'd been dining with my attorney, Margaret Hawthorne, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s who specialized in high-profile financial crimes. Margaret had agreed to represent me after Agent Rodriguez recommended her as someone who understood both the legal complexities and media management aspects of cases involving prominent defendants. There she is, Margaret murmured, not bothering to disguise her interest in Patricia's theatrical entrance. Either she's completely delusional about her legal situation, or she's planning something desperate. Patricia's decision to return to Denver after 3 days in hiding had surprised law enforcement. Agent Rodriguez had called me that morning to report that she'd flown back on a commercial flight under her own name, making no apparent effort to avoid detection. Her behavior suggested either supreme confidence or complete psychological breakdown. I watched Patricia scan the dining room until her eyes found mine. For a moment, that seemed to stretch indefinitely. We stared at each other across the elegant space filled with Denver's most influential citizens. Patricia's expression was unreadable, but I could see the tension in her posture and the slight tremor in her hands as she gripped her designer handbag. She began walking directly toward my table, ignoring the whispered conversations and stares that followed her progress. Margaret placed a restraining hand on my arm as Patricia approached, a silent reminder that anything said in this public setting would likely be repeated throughout Denver society before the evening ended. "Amanda," Patricia said when she reached our table, her voice carrying the same imperious tone she'd always used when addressing me. "I think there's been a terrible misunderstanding about your jewelry situation. Perhaps we could speak privately and resolve this confusion before it goes any further." The audacity of her approach was breathtaking. Patricia was attempting to negotiate as if the federal investigation was merely a family dispute that could be settled through private conversation. She seemed genuinely unaware that her actions had crossed the line from civil matter to serious criminal charges. "Mrs. Whitman," Margaret interjected smoothly. "I'm Margaret Hawthorne, Mrs. Foster's attorney. Any communication regarding the theft of her jewelry collection needs to go through legal channels now that federal charges are pending." Patricia's composure cracked slightly at the mention of federal charges. I could see her calculating the implications of that phrase, finally beginning to understand the severity of her legal situation. Federal charges seem excessive for what amounts to a family disagreement about asset management. Margaret smiled with the kind of professional courtesy that somehow managed to be more intimidating than outright hostility. "Mrs. Whitman, forging, power of attorney documents and stealing property worth over $2 million constitutes serious federal crimes. This stopped being a family matter the moment you committed document fraud to access Mrs. Foster's safety deposit box." The color drained from Patricia's face as the full reality of her situation became clear. Around us, the dining room had gone completely silent as Denver's elite strained to hear every word of the conversation. Patricia's public humiliation was being witnessed by the same social circle she'd spent decades cultivating and manipulating. "I need to speak with my attorney," Patricia said, her voice barely above a whisper. "That would be wise," Margaret replied. "I'm sure Agent Rodriguez will be happy to discuss surrender arrangements once you have proper representation." Patricia turned and walked quickly toward the exit, her perfect posture finally showing signs of collapse. The murmur of conversation that erupted in her wake was immediate and intense. By tomorrow morning, every member of Denver society would know that Patricia Whitman was facing federal charges for stealing jewelry from her son's girlfriend. Margaret waited until Patricia had left the building before speaking. That was either incredibly stupid or incredibly calculated. She's either trying to gauge your willingness to negotiate, or she's creating a public record of attempting to resolve this matter peacefully. I considered the possibilities as we finished our dinner. Patricia's public approach could have been genuine desperation, but it could also have been strategic theater designed to make her appear reasonable while positioning me as vindictive. Either way, her decision to confront me publicly demonstrated that she still underestimated both my resolve and the strength of the case against her. My phone buzzed with a text message from Agent Rodriguez. "Patricia Whitman surrendered to federal authorities 30 minutes ago. Arraignment scheduled for Monday morning. We need to discuss victim impact statement." The formal arrest marked the beginning of the public phase of Patricia's downfall. Within hours, news outlets throughout Colorado would be reporting on the federal charges against one of Denver's most prominent socialites. The story would have everything that media outlets loved: wealth, family drama, massive theft, and the kind of social scandal that wealthy communities tried desperately to keep private. Margaret reviewed the message and nodded approvingly. "Good. Once she's officially charged, the case becomes public record. That will make it easier for other potential victims to come forward and for us to pursue civil restitution." As we left the Denver Country Club, I noticed the unusual number of cars in the parking lot and the small group of people with cameras positioned near the entrance. Word of Patricia's arrest had already leaked, and journalists were beginning to gather at locations where they might catch glimpses of the principals in what was already being called the biggest society scandal in Denver's recent history. "Are you ready for this level of attention?" Margaret asked as we approached my car. I considered the question carefully. The media scrutiny would be intense and intrusive, but it would also ensure that Patricia's crimes received the public attention necessary to encourage other victims to come forward. I think so, and if I'm not ready now, I'll learn to be. The weekend brought a flood of media coverage that exceeded even Margaret's predictions. The Denver Post ran a front-page story about Patricia's arrest with the headline, "Society Matron," charged in multi-million-dollar jewelry theft. Local television stations led their evening news broadcasts with reports about the federal charges, and social media buzzed with speculation about other potential victims and the scope of Patricia's criminal activities. My phone rang constantly with interview requests from reporters, documentary producers, and podcast hosts who wanted to explore the human drama behind the criminal charges. Margaret handled most of the media inquiries, providing carefully crafted statements that portrayed me as a victim seeking justice rather than revenge. More importantly, the publicity generated exactly the response we'd hoped for. By Sunday evening, Agent Rodriguez reported that 6 other families had contacted the FBI with concerns about transactions involving Patricia Whitman. Each case followed a similar pattern. Patricia had approached wealthy individuals or families offering to help with estate sales or charitable donations, then had arranged for questionable appraisals and suspicious auction procedures that resulted in significantly lower proceeds than expected. The total financial damages are looking like they could exceed $10 million, Agent Rodriguez told me during a phone call Sunday night. Patricia appears to have been operating this scheme for at least 5 years, targeting families who trusted her social connections and charitable reputation. The scope of Patricia's criminal enterprise was staggering. She'd used her position in Denver society to gain access to valuable property belonging to people who considered her a friend and trusted advisor. The systematic nature of her fraud suggested sophisticated planning and complete disregard for the people she was victimizing. Monday morning's arraignment drew a crowd that filled the federal courthouse's main gallery. Patricia arrived with her attorney, a high-profile criminal defense lawyer named Jonathan Cross, whose expensive suit and confident manner suggested that the Whitman family was prepared to spend whatever necessary to minimize Patricia's legal consequences. I sat in the second row with Margaret, watching as Patricia stood before federal judge Caroline Morrison to hear the formal charges against her. The litany of crimes was extensive: mail fraud, wire fraud, money laundering, document forgery, theft of property in interstate commerce, and conspiracy to commit fraud. Each charge carried potential sentences of 5 to 20 years in federal prison. Patricia's appearance had deteriorated significantly since her arrest. Her usually perfect hair was simply styled, her makeup was minimal, and her clothing was conservative rather than fashionable. The transformation was clearly calculated to present her as a sympathetic defendant rather than a wealthy socialite who'd stolen millions from trusted friends. Judge Morrison set bail at $5 million and imposed strict travel restrictions that would keep Patricia in Colorado until trial. The conditions also prohibited her from contacting any potential victims or witnesses, which effectively ended her involvement in Denver's charitable and social organizations. As we left the courthouse, Margaret was approached by several other attorneys representing newly identified victims of Patricia's schemes. The coordination of multiple cases would require careful management, but it would also strengthen the prosecution's ability to demonstrate the systematic nature of Patricia's criminal activities. This is going to be the trial of the decade in Denver, Margaret observed as we walked toward her car. Patricia's defense team will try to portray her as a confused widow who made poor business decisions, but the evidence of deliberate fraud is overwhelming. The media scrum outside the courthouse was intense, with reporters shouting questions about my stolen jewelry, my relationship with David, and my plans for recovering the financial losses. Margaret had prepared me for the attention, and I delivered. A brief statement expressing confidence in the justice system and gratitude for the FBI's thorough investigation. That evening, David called for the first time since Patricia's arrest. His voice was hollow with exhaustion and what sounded like clinical depression. "Amanda, I need you to know that I had no idea about any of this. The other victims, the years of fraud, none of it. I thought my mother was exactly who she pretended to be. I believed him, which made the conversation more painful than it would have been if I could simply categorize him as complicit in his mother's crimes. David had been as much a victim of Patricia's manipulation as anyone else, controlled through emotional dependency rather than financial theft. "What are you going to do?" I asked. "I'm selling the real estate company," David replied. "I can't. Maintain business relationships when everyone knows my mother stole from their friends and neighbors. I'm going to use the proceeds to establish a victim compensation fund for people my mother defrauded. The decision was both noble and practical. David's business reputation would never recover from his association with Patricia's crimes, but his voluntary contribution to victim restitution might help him rebuild some form of social standing in Denver's community. "What about us?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. David was quiet for a long moment before responding. "I think we both know that our relationship can't survive this. Not because I blame you for exposing my mother's crimes, but because every time we're together, we'll be reminded of how completely she manipulated both of us." The conversation marked the formal end of our romantic relationship, though it had been effectively over since the morning I learned about the jewelry theft. David and I had been casualties of Patricia's criminal ambitions, collateral damage in her pursuit of money and social control. As I hung up the phone, I realized that Patricia's theft had cost me far more than jewelry and family heirlooms. It had destroyed my relationship with David, forced me to confront the naivety of trusting someone based on social reputation, and required me to become a public figure in a criminal case that would define the next several years of my life. But Patricia's crimes had also given me something valuable: clarity about my own strength and capabilities, and a mission that would transform my professional focus from corporate marketing to victim advocacy. The woman who had stolen my inheritance was about to discover that her actions had created the perfect opponent to ensure she faced complete accountability for her decades of criminal manipulation. Tuesday morning brought news that would transform the case from a regional scandal to a national story. Agent Rodriguez called to inform me that Patricia's arrest had triggered investigations in 3 other states where she'd conducted similar auction schemes using the same network of fraudulent appraisers and complicit auction houses. "We're looking at potential federal charges in Arizona, California, and Florida," Agent Rodriguez explained. "Patricia appears to have been operating a multi-state fraud network targeting wealthy retirees and recent widows in upscale communities." The revelation that Patricia's crimes extended far beyond Denver fundamentally changed the scope of the case and my role as the victim who'd exposed her activities. Media outlets were already reaching out for interviews about the expanding investigation, and victim advocacy groups were contacting Margaret about my potential involvement in supporting other people who'd been defrauded. "You're going to become the face of this case whether you want to or not," Margaret warned me during our Tuesday afternoon meeting. "Patricia's story has everything that captures public attention: wealthy socialite, massive theft, sophisticated fraud scheme, and a victim who fought back successfully." As I drove home through Cherry Creek that evening, passing the luxury boutiques and expensive restaurants where Patricia had entertained the wealthy friends she'd been systematically defrauding, I understood that my quiet life as a marketing executive was permanently over. Patricia Whitman had stolen my jewelry, but she'd also inadvertently launched me into a public role as an advocate for fraud victims and a symbol of successful resistance to sophisticated financial manipulation. The final confrontation was coming, and this time it would be conducted in federal court with the entire country watching. Patricia had spent her life believing that social connections and carefully managed reputation could protect her from consequences. She was about to learn that stealing from the wrong person could bring down everything she'd spent decades building, including the freedom she'd taken for granted while victimizing people who trusted her completely. 18 months after Patricia Whitman first walked into that federal courtroom in handcuffs, I stood at the podium in the packed gallery watching her receive a sentence of 32 years in federal prison. Judge Morrison's voice was steady and unforgiving as she detailed the scope of Patricia's crimes: 47 victims across 6 states, total financial damages exceeding $14 million, and a criminal enterprise that had operated for nearly a decade under the cover of charitable work and social respectability. Patricia sat motionless at the defense table, her once perfect composure finally shattered completely. The woman who had controlled every aspect of her social environment through manipulation and fraud now faced the reality of spending the rest of her life in federal custody. Her expensive legal team had fought valiantly to minimize her sentence, arguing that she suffered from psychological disorders that impaired her judgment, but the evidence of calculated systematic criminal behavior had been overwhelming. The defendant exploited relationships of trust built over years of cultivated friendship, Judge Morrison stated as she explained the reasoning behind the lengthy sentence. She specifically targeted vulnerable individuals during periods of grief and transition, using their emotional distress to facilitate theft of irreplaceable family heirlooms and significant financial assets. The judge's words captured exactly why Patricia's crimes had resonated so powerfully with the public during the 18 months of investigation and trial. She hadn't been a stranger who broke into homes or a distant scammer operating online. She had been the trusted friend who offered help during difficult times, then used that trust to steal the very items that connected her victims to their family histories and departed loved ones. I glanced around the courtroom at the faces of other victims who had traveled from across the country to witness Patricia's sentencing. Eleanor Vasquez, whose late husband's watch collection had been sold for a fraction of its value after Patricia, offered to help with estate management. Robert Chen, who had lost his mother's jade jewelry collection when Patricia convinced him to donate it to a charity auction that turned out to be completely fraudulent. Maria Santos, who had discovered that the diamond ring Patricia helped her sell to pay medical bills was actually worth 40 times what she received. Each of them had a story similar to mine, and each had found the courage to come forward after media coverage of Patricia's arrest made them realize they weren't alone in being victimized. The network of fraud victims had grown into a community of people supporting each other through the complex process of seeking justice and recovering from sophisticated financial manipulation. Judge Morrison concluded the sentencing with an order for complete restitution to all identified victims, including the return of recovered jewelry pieces and financial compensation for items that could not be retrieved. The federal investigation had traced many of the stolen pieces to private collectors and auction houses throughout the United States and Europe, and the process of recovery would continue for years under court supervision. As Patricia was led away in handcuffs for the final time, I felt not triumph but rather a profound sense of closure. The woman who had stolen my grandmother's jewelry collection, believing she could escape consequences through social connections and carefully constructed lies, was facing the reality that justice sometimes moved slowly but arrived nonetheless. Margaret gathered her files and approached me as the courtroom began to empty. 32 years is essentially a life sentence for someone Patricia's age, she observed. Judge Morrison wanted to send a clear message that targeting vulnerable people through trust-based fraud will be punished severely. The sentence was indeed severe, but it reflected the magnitude of Patricia's criminal enterprise and the number of lives she had damaged through her actions. The federal investigation had revealed not just the theft of valuable property, but the emotional devastation caused by losing irreplaceable family heirlooms during periods when people were already grieving the loss of loved ones. Outside the courthouse, I was approached by a reporter from CNN who was working on a documentary about trust-based fraud targeting affluent communities. The story had captured national attention because it illustrated how sophisticated criminals could exploit social respectability and charitable involvement to gain access to victims' most valuable possessions. Mrs. Foster, your decision to pursue federal charges against Patricia Whitman has resulted in the exposure of one of the largest trust-based fraud operations in recent history, the reporter said. What would you tell other people who suspect they might be victims of similar schemes? I had answered variations of this question hundreds of times over the past 18 months, but the importance of the message never diminished. Trust your instincts about transactions that seem too convenient or results that seem inconsistent with your expectations. Real estate and jewelry have documented market values that can be verified through independent appraisals. And most importantly, remember that social connections and charitable involvement don't guarantee honesty. The documentary would air in 3 months as part of a series exploring financial crimes targeting older adults and grieving families. My participation had been carefully coordinated with federal prosecutors to ensure that public education didn't interfere with ongoing investigations in other jurisdictions where Patricia's network had operated. As I drove away from the courthouse for the final time, I reflected on how completely my life had changed since that morning 18 months ago when David told me about the canceled wedding. The marketing executive who had discovered her jewelry missing was gone, replaced by someone whose professional focus had shifted entirely to advocacy for fraud victims and education about financial crimes targeting vulnerable populations. The Foster Institute for Financial Justice had opened 6 months earlier in a restored building in downtown Denver. Funded by the restitution Patricia had been ordered to pay, and donations from grateful families whose cases had been resolved. Through the expanded federal investigation, the Institute provided legal support for fraud victims, educational programs for financial institutions and law enforcement, and research into emerging patterns of trust-based financial crimes. Our first major initiative was a partnership with insurance companies to develop better protocols for identifying suspicious appraisal requests and estate transactions. The program had already prevented several attempted frauds by flagging transactions, where appraisal values seemed inconsistent with standard market evaluations for similar items. Nicole Chen had joined the Institute as Director of Communications and Victim Services, bringing her marketing expertise to the challenge of helping other victims navigate the complex process of reporting financial crimes and cooperating with law enforcement investigations. Her background in crisis management proved invaluable in helping people who were often dealing with both financial loss and profound emotional trauma from betrayed trust. The Patricia Whitman case established a template for how these investigations should be conducted, Nicole explained during a staff meeting where we reviewed the Institute's first year of operations. Federal coordination, victim support services, media management, and public education, working together to ensure comprehensive justice. The template was already being applied to similar cases in other parts of the country. The FBI's Financial Crimes Division had created a specialized unit for trust-based fraud investigations, using techniques developed during the Patricia Whitman case to identify criminal networks operating across multiple states and jurisdictions. My personal jewelry collection had been almost completely recovered through the federal investigation. The emerald necklace that had started everything was returned after being traced to a private collector in Switzerland, who cooperated fully with authorities once he learned about its stolen status. The sapphire brooch, diamond tennis bracelet, and most of the other significant pieces had been located and returned through similar international cooperation. But the monetary value of the recovered jewelry was less important than what the experience had taught me about resilience, justice, and the power of refusing to accept victimization quietly. Patricia had stolen my inheritance expecting that social pressure and family dynamics would prevent me from pursuing serious consequences for her actions. Instead, her theft had revealed strengths I didn't know I possessed, and had launched a mission that was far more meaningful than anything I could have accomplished as a corporate marketing executive. David and I had maintained minimal contact during the investigation and trial, communicating primarily through attorneys about his testimony and his voluntary contribution to victim restitution. He had relocated to Portland and started a small, consulting firm focused on helping nonprofit organizations improve their financial oversight and fraud prevention procedures. His mother's crimes had destroyed his life in Denver, but they had also motivated him to dedicate his professional skills to preventing similar victimization of other families. 6 months after Patricia's sentencing, David called to inform me that he was engaged to a woman he'd met through his nonprofit consulting work. The conversation was brief and cordial, both of us understanding that our shared experience with Patricia's manipulation had created a bond that was both too strong and too painful to maintain through ongoing personal relationship. "I'm glad you're happy," I told him, and meant it sincerely. Patricia's crimes affected both of us, but they don't have to define the rest of our lives. "Thank you, Amanda, for everything, for exposing her crimes, for ensuring that other victims got justice, and for handling all of this with more grace than she deserved. The conversation marked the final closure of that chapter of my life, allowing me to focus completely on the Institute's work and my own continued healing from the experience of being targeted by sophisticated financial manipulation. The Institute's research division had identified troubling patterns in how trust-based fraudsters selected and approached their victims. Wealthy individuals going through major life transitions, recently widowed people with valuable estates, and families dealing with inheritance decisions were all particularly vulnerable to criminals who specialized in offering assistance during emotionally difficult periods. Our educational programs focused on helping people recognize the warning signs of fraudulent offers of assistance and understand the importance of independent verification for any transaction involving valuable property. The response from financial institutions, law enforcement agencies, and victim advocacy groups had been overwhelmingly positive, with requests for training programs far exceeding our initial capacity. "We're having to turn down speaking engagements because we can't keep up with demand," our program coordinator reported during a quarterly review meeting. The Patricia Whitman case really opened people's eyes to how sophisticated these fraud schemes can be. The case had indeed become a landmark in financial crime prosecution, studied in law schools and referenced in legislation designed to strengthen penalties for trust-based fraud. Patricia's systematic targeting of vulnerable individuals through charitable and social connections had illustrated the need for better protective mechanisms and more severe consequences for criminals who exploited relationships of trust. On the 2-year anniversary of discovering my jewelry theft, I stood in my office at the Foster Institute looking out at the Denver skyline and reflecting on the unexpected journey that had begun with Patricia's arrogant assumption that she could steal my inheritance without facing consequences. The woman who had believed her social connections would protect her from justice was now serving a federal prison sentence that would keep her incarcerated for the rest of her life. More importantly, her crimes had been exposed in a way that prevented future victimization and provided justice for dozens of families who might never have received help otherwise. The network of fraud victims had become a community of advocates, and the investigation techniques developed during her case were being used to identify and prosecute similar criminals throughout the country. My grandmother's jewelry collection was displayed in a secure case in the Institute's reception area, serving as a reminder of what the work was ultimately about: protecting the tangible connections between families and their histories from criminals who saw only monetary value in objects that represented generations of love, memory, and tradition. Each piece told a story not just of my family's history, but of the importance of refusing to accept victimization quietly. The emerald necklace that Patricia had sold for $12,000 now served as a symbol of resistance against sophisticated financial manipulation and proof that criminals who exploit trust will eventually face justice, regardless of their social standing or perceived respectability. The Institute's Victim Services Coordinator knocked on my office door, interrupting my reflection. "Amanda, there's a family here from Phoenix who think they might have been victimized by someone using Patricia's methods. They heard about our work and drove up to Denver to meet with us." I gathered my files and prepared to meet with another family whose trust had been exploited by criminals who specialized in targeting people during vulnerable moments. Each new case reminded me why Patricia's theft had ultimately been a gift, providing the motivation and expertise necessary to help other victims find justice and recovery. As I walked toward the conference room where the Phoenix family was waiting, I smiled at the irony of how completely Patricia's theft had backfired. She had stolen my jewelry expecting to escape consequences through social manipulation and family pressure. Instead, her crimes had created the perfect advocate to ensure that trust-based fraud victims would have support, resources, and a pathway to justice. Patricia Whitman was spending her remaining years in federal prison, but her criminal legacy was being transformed into protection for future potential victims and hope for people who had already been harmed by similar schemes. The jewelry she had stolen to fund a wedding that never happened had become the foundation for an institute dedicated to ensuring that criminals like her would face swift and severe consequences for exploiting relationships of trust. The war she had started by stealing my inheritance was over, and justice had prevailed in ways she could never have anticipated. Sometimes the best revenge was simply refusing to remain silent about crimes that depended on victim shame and isolation for their success. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.